We wrap up today this series entitled Follow Me. And for those of you who might be our guests today, let me explain a little bit. Between Christmas and Good Friday and Easter, sort of the bookend events of Jesus' life, we as a church focus entirely on the person of Jesus, who he was, what he taught, etc. We read through a gospel together. In fact, this year was the Gospel of John. And then, of course, on Sunday mornings, all we do is talk about Jesus. This is the second of two series exclusively focused on Jesus. Follow me is a phrase that Jesus would use a lot as you encounter him in the Gospels of your Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was one of Jesus' ways of describing what it means to be a Christian, in fact. We in America, 20 centuries later, tend to think of being a Christian in terms of believing in Jesus, or believing that he died on the cross for our sins, or believing that he rose physically from the dead 3 days later. And Jesus would use that phrase, believe in me too, but he would use this one just as much. And if you understand that phrase the way that people in his day did, then you know Jesus was making an offer to people. And he still makes the same offer today to you and I. And it is very simply for us to be his students. Follow me is an expression that rabbis, religious or spiritual leaders of Jesus' day would use about themselves. And they would say, come and follow me, become my student, relearn life from me. And that's what Jesus asked of his followers then. It's what he asks of you and I now. And if you've been with us for any part of this series, then you can kind of remember back to all these different stories or episodes from the Gospels that we've looked at about this expression, follow me. Jesus asked a tax collector named Matthew to get up out of his tax collecting booth and follow him. For Matthew, that meant he had to stop that day being a shameful social pariah, and he had to change the course of his life immediately from a life of excess and having as much as he ever wanted to something very different. Jesus said, follow me, to a rich young man. But Jesus said that to that man, if you're going to do it, you need to change your relationship with your stuff because you have too much and other people have too little. And that rich young man chose not to follow Jesus because of what Jesus asked. And on down the list it goes. There is in your leaflet today an announcement about something that Christians do together. We've done it together for 20 centuries. It's called baptism. If you want more information about it, you can find some on the leaflet stands at the back of the worship area. During this series, you may have found yourself saying, you know, I've considered myself a Christian most of my life, but now I get it about what that means. It goes deeper than just being superficial or skin deep. There is more of a commitment here. This is more about my life. This is more about me really meaning it. And if that's the case, I would recommend to you that you seriously consider being baptized, because that's how people have responded to Jesus, to publicly say, I am with him and I am a follower of his for now 2,000 years. So if that interests you, you can talk to me about it or grab one of those info sheets. And we would love to celebrate that with you. Here is the last passage that we are going to look at in regard to following Jesus. This is taken from a larger passage that occupies most of the early part of John chapter 10, a fairly famous passage where Jesus says, he is a good shepherd to us. I picked these verses simply because it contains our expression that is at the center of this series. Jesus says about himself in John chapter 10, beginning in verse 3, the gatekeeper opens the gate for him, me, the good shepherd. And the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own sheep, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. And they will not follow a stranger, but they run away from him because they do not know the stranger's voice. Now, Jesus here, when he is speaking this story, when he's painting this word picture about his relationship with his disciples or followers. He's tapping into a very common biblical metaphor or image that you find all over your Old Testament, Jesus' Bible, the Bible before him and the apostles who planted the church. For instance, probably one of the 2 or 3 most famous passages in your Bible that gets read at every funeral I've ever done is Psalm 23 from your Old Testament, in which God himself is compared to a good shepherd who leads us beside still waters, puts us to bed or to rest in green pastures, and on and on and on it goes. So when the hearers of John chapter 10 heard Jesus use the metaphor or image of a shepherd about himself, their ears would have perked up because they'd heard this stuff before. But of course they'd heard it about God mostly before. But in your Old Testament, God also tells his people in a passage probably most significantly like Ezekiel chapter 34, that their leaders at the time were terrible shepherds to them. They took advantage of the people, they did not protect the people, etc. But someday, God himself was going to come and regather God's people together and was going to send one good shepherd, the Messiah, to look over God's people and to protect them. So when the people that day heard Jesus talk about being a good shepherd in John 10, they also heard this Old Testament promise. They heard Jesus saying about himself, I am that one good shepherd that God promised to send to you, to lead you, to protect you, to provide for you. And so their interest, of course, would have been even all the more piqued. Now, this is not an image, this is not a metaphor that is something that you and I probably experience every day. They're from an agrarian society. Every single person in the audience, the day that Jesus spoke, John chapter 10, would have known and would have seen exactly what Jesus is describing. They lived among farmlands. They lived among shepherds. Every one of them knew a shepherd by name. What did Jesus describe? He said that, you know, my audience in the 1st century AD in Palestine, you know that overnight it is very common for shepherds to put their sheep in a pen. Could be a hollowed out cave in the side of a hill, could be a makeshift pen of sticks and brambles and branches. It could be a more permanent pen made out of stone. But overnight, to rest and to be safe from predators like wolves and foxes, shepherds would pen up their flocks. And because pens were fairly expensive, you would put more than one flock, led by more than one shepherd, into the same pen. And then some poor bloke pulls guard duty all night to make sure that nobody steals any of the sheep from that pen. And then in the morning, if you lived 20 centuries ago in 1st century Israel, you would have heard shepherds stand outside the pen and they would have called their sheep by name. Donner, Blitzen, Dasher, I don't know. Those are about the only 3 Santa's reindeer that I know. Ralph, Charlie, whoever. And they would call out by name to their sheep. And what you would watch is only their sheep would come out of the pen. Not any of the other sheep in any of the other flocks. Why? Well, as Jesus says in John 10, 3-5, because those sheep, like your pet dog at home, know his voice. And they hear it. And they come out to him. And then what a shepherd would do in Jesus' day is that he would take those sheep to a place to graze, perhaps. Or maybe it would be a day of travel where he's moving them from place to place like a rancher might do with cattle to a new pen overnight. And the shepherd would be at the front of the flock, calling to them all day long, along the trails, along the roads. And he would be calling to them to follow. And they would follow after him because they hear his voice and they know his voice. And so tight was this connection between the shepherd and his sheep that someone else could call them by name and they would not follow because they only followed the voice that they heard and knew, not a stranger's voice, as Jesus says in verse 5 of John 10. What does this tell you about following Jesus? If you're going to say, like me, that you are a Christian, you are a follower of Jesus, how did Jesus mean that in this particular passage? Well, look again. It has to do with his voice, right? In fact, you would say it this way. Anyone who says they are a follower of Jesus chooses to follow him because we hear and we know his voice. Now see, at this point, this taps into a question, a nagging doubt that every single person in the room has, me included. And the reason I know this is lots of books are written about it, lots of blog posts are written about it, and I have lots of pastoral conversations with people, with you, about this question. Know what it is? How do I know what God is saying to me? How do I know that God is really speaking to me? And if he is, what on earth is he saying? I'll bet if you've been around the church block once or twice, I'll bet that if you've been a Christian for longer than a few years, you've run face first into that vexing question. And that is precisely what Jesus is talking about in this passage. He says, matter-of-factly, hey, let me tell you something about my sheep. Let me tell you something about those who say they are my disciples, that they are with me. They hear my voice, and they know my voice. And when they hear it and they know it, they follow after me. Wow, that's daunting. When was the last time you felt like you heard Jesus' voice and knew it definitively? When? How long has it been since you heard Jesus' voice and knew it definitively? It makes this passage both powerful and poignant. It speaks to this deep question and need that all of us have, no matter how long we have been Christians, right? That's why, by the way, it's interesting to me as an interpreter and reader and teacher of the Bible that one of the most well-loved, powerful images in the Bible is that of God being a shepherd. What's most fascinating to me about that is you don't know any shepherds. Not a one. There is nobody you know who is employed as a shepherd. Certainly not the way that everybody back then would have known a shepherd. So this is a metaphor, this is an image that has lost all of its cultural meaning to us. And yet, at every funeral I've ever done, the family always asks, please be sure to read Psalm 23. Why is that? I'll bet it's because everybody in the room wants a shepherd. We may not know one who does it vocationally, but we yearn for someone to look out for us and to care for us like a shepherd does. It speaks to our soul. It speaks to human need. It always has. I think that's why it's such a beloved image. And we yearn to know and to hear Jesus' voice. So let's spend our time looking at that specifically. In this very famous passage about Jesus being a good shepherd who calls out to his sheep and they follow his voice, what does Jesus tell you about how he will be speaking to you so that you will know when and how to follow him. Well, let's pull some things directly from what Jesus said specifically. Jesus says in these 3 verses that the shepherd would always call to the sheep from this pen, this overnight place of rest and safety. And he would call them out by name to go graze during the day or move to a new meadow, move to a new pen someplace some miles away. And then, of course, at the end of the day, he would put them back in the pen to be safe overnight from predators and thieves, etc. What does this tell you about when Jesus speaks and how you'll know it? Well, it tells me that Jesus says to all of us, we can anticipate that he is going to be moving us from one of 2 seasons or phases in life. From one to the other and then back again, like a shepherd in his day. What are those 2 phases or seasons? One is a phase of rest and safety, being in that animal pen overnight with not a worry, because you're protected and no one can get at you. But then sometimes he calls you from the pen to go someplace new, someplace you've never seen before, and all you have to do is follow after him to get there. What's Jesus calling you to do in your life right now? How can you hear and know his voice so that you can follow him? Well, this text tells us he is trying to move you to one of 2 places. Maybe you have been through a terrible season of stress, of circumstances that have just worn you out, of hardship. Then I think this text tells you you can bank on the fact that Jesus right now in your life is trying to call to you to come to a place of safety and rest. Maybe just for a little while. Go into this animal enclosure and just plop down, breathe a sigh of relief, and rest. This is what Jesus the Good Shepherd does because that's what shepherds in Jesus' day did. And that's the image that Jesus claims for himself. Maybe you've been working a lot, and you've needed to. It's been a necessary thing. There's no harm in that, but you can feel it. You're tired. You're not just physically exhausted, you're spiritually and emotionally exhausted. Guess what? I can anticipate for you, based on this passage, what Jesus' voice is trying to tell you. Will you hear it and will you follow? He is trying to bring you to a place of safety and rest so that you can be rejuvenated, so that you can heal. Rest up for what's next. And of course, vice versa is true. You may have been going through a relatively calm period in your life where you feel like you are drawing strength, where you feel like you are getting better, where you feel like you haven't had a care in the world. Then guess what? I'd like to anticipate for you what Jesus' voice in your life right now is trying to tell you. He is calling you out of the pen to someplace new. He is calling you out to follow him and go someplace that you may have never seen before. Maybe it's a little anxious. Maybe it makes you a little afraid. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a change in job. Maybe it's a change in venue in your life. Maybe it's a change in the crowd that you run with. I don't know what he's asking you to do. What I know is if you can identify in your life that you've been through a season of rest and tranquility, Jesus is calling you out to follow him to someplace new. This is what John 10, 3-5 shows us. This is how you can know and identify in your life the voice of Jesus so that you can follow him. Now, what else did you observe or hear in those 3 verses about the voice of Jesus that we are supposed to follow? Well, you heard Jesus himself say, like a shepherd in his day, he is always at the front end of his flock, calling them to follow him. What does that tell you about where you can find Jesus' voice in your own life so that you can follow him? He's always ahead of you. He is always calling to you to get up to speed with and to follow in his footsteps. He does not ask you to go any place that he himself is not willing to go with you. In fact, he is going to go ahead of you into that place. And all he wants you to do is follow his voice and come with him, whatever it might be. Some new risk he wants you to take. Some new initiative he wants you to take. Some change that he wants you to make. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. Jesus is already ahead of you, calling to you to follow him. This is what we know about Jesus' voice. And now the question is, will we listen and look hard enough to find where Jesus is ahead of us in life to follow him? Please note, he's not behind you. He is not in your past, beating you up for who you were or what you've done. That's you doing that. It's not him. He's not behind you, pushing you in the back to motivate you to get going. That's not what he does. He'll play that role if he needs to. That's not his ideal. You know where he is? He's ahead of you. He is thinking days and weeks and months and years ahead of you. And he just wants you to heed his voice and to follow. You want to find Jesus' voice? You want to know Jesus' voice in your life? You need to start looking ahead. Because that's where he said, as the good shepherd, he would be. And then last, this is frankly the most basic, fundamental thing that I could ever say to you about what God, or in this case Jesus, is speaking to you today or any day of your life. And it is simply this acknowledgement. Jesus is saying today the same thing he always has been saying, which is the same thing that he did 2,000 years ago. If you asked his followers, his disciples, guys like Matthew and Peter and James and John, hey, tell me about Jesus' voice. You know what they'd tell you? They'd describe his laugh to you. They'd describe what it's like when he gets real passionate and you can feel the emotion in his voice. But you know else what they'd say? They'd say, I remember when he taught us about not just loving our friends, but loving our enemies and praying for those who persecute us. I have never been able to forget that. I remember when he taught us that we are supposed to forgive people the way that we want God to forgive us. I have never been able to shake that. I remember when he said the truly blessed people in life are those who have been humbled, those who mourn, those who are peacemakers. I've never been able to forget that. I remember when he told us to not judge, because we will be judged the way that we judge other people. And I have never been able to shake that. This is what they would tell you about the voice of Jesus. And the bottom line is, you and I have access to the voice of Jesus in that regard. You want to know why it is that we spend 3 months every year as a church reading the gospel? It's so you can hear the voice of Jesus. Because the voice of Jesus is the only voice that is ever going to change your life. Mine won't, yours won't. But Jesus will change your life. And once you catch his voice from the Gospels, and you encounter what he did and what he said and what he taught and the way that it can transform you, you'll never let it go. So let me assure you, what is Jesus' voice saying to you today? the same thing he's always been saying. Sometimes we're the ones who are guilty of thinking, Jesus, I need you to speak to me in this certain way. I have a job change that I'm considering. I need your help. I'm not sure what school to put my kids in. I need your help. I have a teenager that's going off the rails. I need your help. I'm the parent of a teenager. I'm going off the rails. I need your help. I have an unanswered prayer in my life. I don't understand why you're not answering this prayer for me. I need your help. And God cares about all those things, of course. Let me tell you what I know He cares about every single day of your life. Are you going to love your enemies, not just your friends? Are you going to pray for those who persecute you? Are you going to seek to forgive other people the way that you yearn for God to forgive you? Are you going to believe that you should not judge other people because the way you judge them is the way that you will yourself be judged? This is what Jesus has been trying to say to the entire human race for 20 centuries now. We need to get our priority lists right. I can assure you that this very day, this very Sunday morning, Jesus' voice is trying to say to every life in the room the stuff that you know in the Gospels. Today He is saying to you, let me be your good shepherd. Entrust yourself to me. Follow me to safety and rest or into something new. Follow my voice that is already ahead of you, pointing the way. This is what we know from the Gospels His voice will be about. This is what He wants to accomplish in your life. We have to get our priority lists straight, right? And I'm going to say it just in passing because there's not time really to explore it much more than that. Jesus also says, next slide, Ken. There we go. He also says very clearly in this passage that His is not the only voice that you will be hearing. There are other competitors, what He calls strangers. And you and I have to be acute enough. We have to hear well enough to know the difference between the two. How many times have you in your life tried something or ventured out in a certain way only to figure out after the fact, wow, that wasn't really God calling me to do this, that was me. And He'll help you untie that knot when that happens, by the way. But His is not the only voice that you'll be hearing. So often there are other people who are trying to influence you. There's baggage that you carry that is trying to influence you. That's why it's so important to identify what it is that we know Jesus' voice will be saying to us. He is not the one trying to beat you over the head with your guilt or your shame. We know that. That's you. That's a stranger. We know that He is not the one who is trying to help you build a life that is just more and more successful for you and your family. How do we know that? Because that ain't what Jesus is about. We can go chapter and verse on that from your very Bible. There are strangers who are trying to point you in a direction that Jesus doesn't want. They are trying to pollute or poison your life. And we'd be wise, on occasion, to remember that all of us have these strange voices trying to lead us away from who Jesus is and what He wants to do for us. So what'd you learn today? You learned that if we are going to say we follow Jesus, this means we have to know and hear and follow His voice. And you at least now know 3 distinct ways that you can take to the bank. Jesus will always be speaking to you. Always. At any given juncture in your life, no matter your age, your life situation, your vocation, whatever. All of us, Jesus speaks these 3 ways. Let me read to you what one of the great devotionals, daily devotionals of the Christian faith, called My Utmost for His Highest by Oswald Chambers, says about this topic. Oswald Chambers writes, we all as Christians need to get in the habit of saying, "Speak, Lord." And then life will become like a romance. Every time circumstances press in on us, we need to say, "Speak, Lord." And then we need to make time to listen. Hardship is meant to bring us to the point of saying, "Speak, Lord." Think back to a time when God spoke to you. Do you remember what he said? And each time that we listen, our ears become more and more sensitive. And eventually, like Jesus, we will begin to hear God speak to us all the time. Who in the room doesn't want a relationship with God like that? This is a good day for us to actually put into practice what it is that we talked about for half an hour. And the way we're going to do that is you will find one of those many handouts on your chairs. You will find a half green sheet that looks like this. On it are the 3 ways that I mentioned to you from John 10 we can know that Jesus will be speaking to us, so that then we can follow him. What I'd like you to do is to spend the next couple of minutes giving Jesus the space to speak to you about one of these 3 things. We know from his own words that this is how he wants to be speaking to us. Let's give him the chance to actually do it. Now, the song, incidentally, you're going to hear that's going to play while you do this for a couple of minutes is an instrumental version, a very simple, beautiful instrumental version of a well-known old hymn called "I Hear the Voice of Jesus Say." So would you take a couple of minutes? The tech in the back will play the CD. Use this to hear the voice of Jesus about your life right now. Ask him to speak to you so you will follow.